The triplets had driven out 11 maids in 4 months, not fired them, driven them out. One quit after finding her suitcase packed and waiting at the front door at 3 a.m. Another left after the boys rewired the smart home system to lock her out of every room except the bathroom. The agency had stopped sending replacements until Aliyah showed up, curvy, unbothered, and completely unimpressed by 3 17-year-olds who had clearly never once in their lives met a woman who refused to flinch. She walked into that house with a suitcase, a contract, and absolutely no idea that 3 teenagers were about to make her question every life decision she had ever made. And the man who owned the house, the most feared man in Seoul's underground, stood at the top of that staircase and looked down at her, and something inside him, something he had locked away so deep he had genuinely forgotten it existed, cracked open like a fault line. He didn't move, he didn't speak, he just looked at her, and the air in that foyer changed, and nothing in either of their lives would ever be the same. Welcome to Afro-Korean Drama Empire Chocolate Drops. Please like, share, and subscribe. Let's dive in. Im Woo-jin did not advertise what he was. That was, in fact, the point. His name appeared on the boards of 3 legitimate companies, a logistics firm, a real estate development group, and a private security consultancy that managed contracts for half the government's sensitive infrastructure. None of those boards knew the full picture. The full picture was that Woo-jin ran the most disciplined criminal organization in South Korea, had done so for 11 years since his father died, and left him an empire built on blood and silence, and had never once lost a war he'd chosen to fight. He was 38 years old, and he had the eyes of someone who had already lived through the worst version of every possible thing and had simply decided to keep going anyway. He had 3 sons. Triplets. 17 years old, Taeyoon, Junsu, and Hajin. They were the only thing in the world that could make Im Woo-jin genuinely, completely, visibly helpless. Not because they were difficult. Well, they were difficult. They were spectacularly, creatively, and with what appeared to be enormous personal satisfaction, difficult. But it wasn't the difficulty that undid him. It was the love underneath it, the love he had for 3 boys who had grown up in the shadow of a world they only partially understood, who had lost their mother at 6 years old, who had been raised in a house full of loyalty and silence and expensive things and very little that resembled warmth. Woo-jin had tried, he had always tried. But there is a specific kind of wound that a father inflicts without meaning to simply by being absent in the way that powerful men are absent, present in the body, present in the house, but somewhere else entirely inside themselves. His sons had grown up knowing they were loved and not always feeling it, which is a particular kind of loneliness that teenagers express in the only language available to them, which is chaos. The maids knew about the chaos. Word traveled, as word does in the circles of domestic staff in Seoul's wealthiest neighborhoods, and the word was specific and consistent. Do not take the Im household contract. It looked good on paper. The house was a 3-story modern compound in the hills above the city, with a view that photographers would cry over. The salary was exceptional, the employer himself was rarely present, and when he was exacting but not cruel. It was the triplets, it was always the triplets. Taeyoon, the eldest by 4 minutes, was the strategist. He had his father's cold intelligence and had decided, somewhere around age 14, to deploy it entirely in service of his own entertainment. He did not raise his voice. He did not throw things. He simply engineered situations with the patient precision of a much older person, tiny modifications to the household routine, small misplacements of items, carefully constructed misunderstandings, delivered to new staff with the earnest face of someone trying to be helpful. He had caused 3 maids to walk out in tears without ever technically doing anything wrong, and he found this deeply satisfying. Junsu was the one who made noise. He was the middle child of the trio and had the energy of someone who was constitutionally opposed to stillness in any form. He blasted music through the house at volumes that made the windows flex. He left every cabinet open, every drawer half pulled, every light on in every room regardless of whether anyone was using it. He had the particular talent of making messes that looked accidental but required enormous creative effort to produce. He had also, at various points, convinced 3 separate housekeepers that the house was haunted, that there was a gas leak, and that the neighborhood association had issued a formal complaint requiring all staff to vacate immediately. None of these things were true. Junsu had not yet found an idea too absurd to attempt. Hajin was the youngest by 11 minutes and the most dangerous of the 3, which was saying something given the competition. Hajin was quiet. Hajin had very large, very innocent-looking eyes and spoke in a soft, respectful voice and deployed these qualities like weapons. He was the one who would find a new housekeeper on her first day and very gently, very kindly, spend 45 minutes explaining to her all the specific rules of the household that did not exist. The salt should be stored by color gradation. Mr. Im's towels must face north on the rack. The kitchen knives should be arranged by the year of their manufacture. Hajin would explain all of this with such solemn sincerity that grown women wrote it down. Then they would spend 2 weeks trying to follow rules that made no sense, failing and eventually leaving, convinced they were simply not qualified for the position. Ha-Jin considered this a personal achievement. The 11 maids before Aliyah had lasted an average of 19 days. Woo-Jin's head of household staff, a 50-year-old man named Secretary Bae, who had served the Im family for 20 years and had the resigned patience of someone who has accepted that their employer's children are going to be the death of them professionally, if not literally, had told him 3 times that the situation was becoming untenable. Woo-Jin had told Secretary Bae to find someone better each time. Secretary Bae had done his best. The 8th candidate was a woman of 53 with 30 years of domestic service experience who lasted 6 days. The 9th lasted 11. The 10th, who had come highly recommended from a Chibal family and had survived 2 separate family scandals and 1 criminal investigation in her previous employment, lasted 4 days before calling Secretary Bae from the driveway at 11 in the morning and informing him that she would be leaving her uniform on the front step and required payment by wire transfer within 24 hours. Secretary Bae had gone back to Woo-Jin in desperation. Woo-Jin had looked at him with the expression of a man who did not have time for this and said that perhaps the next candidate should have a different approach entirely. That perhaps what was needed was someone who could not be easily intimidated or outmaneuvered. Secretary Bae had taken this instruction seriously and had thought about it for 3 days and had ultimately placed a call to an agency that specialized in what they described diplomatically as complex household environments. The agency had sent him a file. Secretary Bae had read it twice and called the agency back to confirm certain details. Then he had called Aliyah Carter. Aliyah was 26 years old. She was from Atlanta originally, had been living in Seoul for 2 years on a work visa that she'd arranged through a teaching program that had subsequently lost its funding, leaving her in possession of a valid visa, functional Korean, and a pressing need for employment. She was not a professional housekeeper. What she was, as her file indicated and as Secretary Bae had confirmed through the references she provided, was someone who had spent 2 years managing her aunt's household in Lagos, including 4 boys between the ages of 12 and 17 before her aunt relocated. She had also, in her teens, helped raise 2 younger brothers, worked every school break in a community center in Atlanta that served adolescent boys from difficult backgrounds, and had, according to one reference, a supernatural gift for refusing to be moved by things that were designed to move her. The reference had actually used the word supernatural. Secretary Bae had found this promising. Aliyah had found the posting through the agency, had read the description including the understated note about the challenging household dynamic, and had thought about it for 1 evening before agreeing. She was practical about these things. The salary was more than double anything else available to her in Seoul. She had a visa to maintain. She could handle teenagers. She had handled teenagers. She had, in fact, been told by a 14-year-old in Lagos that she was the scariest adult he had ever met and had considered this among the finest compliments of her professional life. She arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September with a medium-sized suitcase, a tote bag that contained, among other things, a journal, 2 novels, a container of her mother's spice blend because she had learned early that cooking was a diplomatic tool, and the absolute unshakable conviction that she was not going to be run out of this job. The house was, she had to admit, stunning, the kind of modern architecture that looked effortless and cost a spectacular amount of money. She stood in the driveway for a moment and looked at it and felt the particular feeling of walking into something large. Secretary met her at the door, shook her hand with the grip of a man who was profoundly relieved to see her, gave her the tour at a pace that suggested he had somewhere to be, and outlined her duties in the efficient shorthand of someone who had given this speech 8 times. The house, the kitchen, the schedule, the boys' meal preferences, the household rules. At the end of the tour, he paused in the foyer and looked at her with the expression of someone about to say something honest. The boys, he said carefully, are going through a phase. How long has the phase been going on? Aliyah asked. 3 years, Secretary Bae said. Aliyah nodded slowly. Okay, the last maid left 4 days ago. The boys are currently at school. They return at 4. I'll be ready, Aliyah said. Secretary Bae looked at her for a moment. He seemed to want to say something more, but didn't. He showed her to her room, a comfortable space on the 2nd floor near the west staircase, told her Mr. Im would be in the house this evening and would expect to be introduced, and then left with the slightly dazed energy of a man who has handed off a problem and is cautiously optimistic for the first time in a year. Aliyah unpacked. She made herself tea. She walked through the kitchen and took stock of what was in it, because knowing a kitchen was the first step to knowing a household. She found, among the usual items, a bag of premium instant ramen with the label handwritten on the outside, in what appeared to be 3 different handwritings arguing about the optimal preparation method, which told her something useful. She found a shelf of snacks organized with the specific obsessive logic of teenagers who cared deeply about ownership and hierarchy. She found in the back of one cabinet a notebook that contained what appeared to be a detailed operational log of the previous maid's daily movements, including times, routes, and notes on vulnerabilities. This notebook was labeled, in confident block letters, Operation Maid Eviction Volume 12. Aaliyah read the notebook for 10 minutes, then she put it back exactly where she found it. She was going to need a different approach. At 4:15, the front door opened and 3 pairs of shoes hit the foyer floor in rapid succession. She was in the kitchen. She did not go out to meet them. She continued preparing the afternoon snack she'd started 20 minutes ago, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who lived here. They would come to the kitchen eventually. They always did. She heard them first. A brief, low-voiced conversation near the stairs. A pause. Then footsteps. 3 sets, moving toward the kitchen with the particular quality of teenagers who are being tactical about their approach, but are trying to sound casual. The door swung open. 3 boys appeared in the frame and stopped. They were tall. She hadn't expected that, though she should have, given their father's build which she'd seen in the photograph Secretary Bay had shown her. They had their father's sharp features and something of their mother's expressiveness. She would learn later. Though right now, what she mostly registered was that all 3 of them had the same expression, which was an assessment. A rapid, comprehensive assessment of the new variable in their kitchen. Tae-yoon spoke first. "You're the new one." "I am," Aaliyah said without turning from the stove. "Snacks are on the counter. Don't eat standing up if you can help it. It's bad for digestion." A beat of silence. "She didn't turn around," Junso said to his brothers not quietly enough. "I can hear you," Aaliyah said pleasantly. "Plates are in the second cabinet." "Top shelf." Another beat. She heard the sound of a cabinet opening, which was promising. Hodgins' voice came next, softer than his brother's, with the specific quality she had already catalogued from the notebook as the dangerous one. "Our last housekeeper always introduced herself first. She brought flowers, actually. She was very warm." "Did she last?" Aaliyah asked. Silence. "Sit down," she said. "Food's almost ready." She turned around finally and looked at them. They were looking at her with expressions that were recalibrating in real time. The initial assessment shifting into something more complicated. She was not what they'd expected. She was aware of that. She'd learned a long time ago that being a curvy black woman in unexpected spaces produced a very specific kind of recalibration in people, a moment of recategorization where they tried to place her in a framework that already existed and found that she didn't quite fit anywhere they'd prepared. She had stopped finding this uncomfortable and started finding it useful. She set 3 plates on the counter. Rice, braised short rib that had been slow cooking since noon, seasoned spinach, egg. Real food, not something thrown together. Junsu looked at the plate, and then at her, and then at the plate again. "You cooked this?" "I did. Our last housekeeper just ordered delivery." "I noticed there wasn't much actual cooking happening," she said, sitting down across from them with her own cup of tea. "That's fine, I cook." Hajin was looking at her with those careful eyes. She could see him building something, the quiet preliminary assembly of whatever play he was about to make. She let him build it. "Mr. Im has very specific rules about the household," Hajin said with the solemn sincerity she'd read about in the notebook, particularly about the kitchen. "The spices have to be arranged in order of their country of origin. The knives should face northeast on the magnetic strip, and no one is allowed in the pantry after 8 p.m. because of the humidity regulations." "Interesting," Aaliyah said. "None of that is in the actual household manual that Secretary Bay gave me, but I'll be sure to ask Mr. Im to confirm it when I meet him tonight." She looked at Hajin directly, in person. "I'll ask him specifically about the spice arrangement by country of origin." Something flickered in Hajin's eyes, the first crack in the careful composure. "That's fine," he said after a half-second too long. "Good," she said. She picked up her tea. "Eat before it gets cold." Tae-yoon, who had not spoken since the first exchange, was watching her with an expression that was more complex than his brother's. He was the strategist, she reminded herself, the one who thought before he moved. He ate 3 bites of rice, set his chopsticks down, and looked at her with the flat, assessing gaze that she recognized as his father's, though she didn't know that yet. "You've read about us," he said. "Not a question." "I read my file," she said, "same as you presumably read yours." "What file?" "The notebook in the back of the 3rd cabinet. Volume 12. She watched his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "You should label it less clearly if you don't want people to find it, just a thought." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Then Junsu started laughing. It was involuntary, she could tell, the kind of laugh that escapes a person before they can stop it. He clapped a hand over his mouth. Tae-yoon shot him a look. Ha-jin's expression had shifted into something that was almost, not quite, but almost impressed. "Eat," Aaliyah said again and picked up her novel. She met Im Woo-jin that evening. She had not been specifically prepared for the impact of him in person, which she would later consider an oversight on Secretary Bay's part. The photograph had shown a tall Korean man in a suit with a serious face. The actual man was something considerably more complicated than a tall Korean man in a suit with a serious face. He came through the front door at 7:15, still in his coat, phone at his ear, completing a call in a voice so low and flat it barely carried, and Secretary Bay intercepted him in the foyer with the new hire information. Woo-jin ended the call, turned, and looked up toward the landing where Aaliyah was descending the stairs. He stopped. It was brief, half a second, maybe less. The kind of stop that a controlled, self-possessed man makes when something registers unexpectedly, and then it was over and his expression was smooth and composed, and he was walking toward her with the specific unhurried authority of someone who owns every room they enter without having to announce it. But she had noticed. She filed it away without knowing quite what to do with it. "Mrs. Carter," he said. His English was precise, slightly formal, the kind built on extensive reading rather than extensive conversation. "Mr. Im," she said, "I made dinner. It's in the kitchen when you're ready." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his expression, something small and almost surprised. He nodded once, which she would learn was his version of thank you. She went back to the kitchen. She heard him behind her, the soft sound of his coat being handed to Secretary Bay, the particular quality of his footsteps, even and deliberate, and she focused very carefully on plating the food, and not on the fact that her heart was doing something mildly inconvenient. He sat at the kitchen table, not the formal dining room, the kitchen. She wasn't sure what to make of that. They didn't talk much. She served the food. He ate. She ate across from him, which she'd been slightly uncertain about, but which seemed right given the informal setting. At some point he looked up from his plate and said simply, "This is good." "Thank you," she said. A pause. "The boys," he said. "We're fine today," she said. He looked at her. She could see him weighing that statement, running it against what he knew about the boys, and what the last 8 maids had said about the boys on their way out the door. "They weren't a problem," he said. "They were getting to know me," she said. "That's different." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The last woman called them feral." "They're not feral," Aaliyah said. "They're smart and bored and testing what they can move. That's different." She looked at him. "They'll be fine." Wu Jin looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. Then he went back to his food. That night, in his study on the 3rd floor, with Seoul spread below the windows, and the house quiet around him, Wu Jin sat at his desk and thought about the woman in his kitchen who had said they'll be fine with the specific, unshakable certainty of someone who had already decided the outcome. He thought about the way she'd moved through his house without hesitation, as if she'd already learned its geometry. He thought about the way she'd looked at him when she said it, direct and calm and entirely unimpressed by the specific weight of him that made most people in a room at least slightly smaller. He had not been looked at that way in a very long time. He opened the folder on his desk, quarterly reports from the logistics arm. He read the first paragraph 3 times. He closed the folder. This was, he told himself, not something he had time for. The boys attempted 3 separate operations in the first week. Taeyun's was the most sophisticated. He had been awake until 2 in the morning, Alia later discovered, engineering a situation where every item in the kitchen would be in the wrong place by morning, not dramatically, not visibly, but in the specific small degrees off way that caused maximum confusion during meal preparation. Alia noticed within 4 minutes of starting breakfast, understood immediately what had happened, and spent 5 of those minutes putting things back while mentally noting that Taeyun had a gift for spatial reasoning that would serve him very well in a field that wasn't annoying housekeepers. Then she walked to his bedroom door, knocked twice, opened it when he said yes with the sleepy outrage of a teenager who did not expect to be woken at 6:50, and set a glass of water and a plate of toast on his desk. "You'll need energy," she said pleasantly, "for school and for undoing whatever you did in the pantry, which you'll do after school today." Taeyun stared at her. "I didn't do anything in the pantry." "I know," she said, and yet she closed the door. She heard him moving things around for 35 minutes after he got home. Junsu's attempt was louder and less subtle. He found the speaker system in the living room, connected it to his phone, and set a timer for 4 in the morning to blast music at a volume that he estimated would be impossible to sleep through. Alia woke up at 3:50, went downstairs, disconnected the speaker system, replaced it with the Bluetooth connection to her own phone, and when the timer went off at 4, what played instead of Junseo's chosen track was a 40-minute recording of a woman reading Korean grammar exercises at a steady, merciless pace. She had downloaded this specifically for Korean study purposes and had been meaning to listen to it for weeks. She listened to the first 15 minutes from the kitchen while making herself tea and went back to bed. Junseo appeared at breakfast looking like he hadn't slept. "Morning," Alia said, setting rice porridge in front of him. "How was your night?" He looked at the porridge. He looked at her. He ate the porridge in complete silence, which was the quietest she had ever seen him. Hajin's approach was the one she'd been most prepared for. He came to her on the 3rd day with a very serious expression and a list of 12 household rules that he explained with tremendous solemnity had been in place since the household was established. Alia listened to the entire list, nodding at intervals. Then she said, "Fascinating. I'll confirm all of these with your father this evening when he gets home." Hajin's face stayed still, barely. "Actually," he said, "he's very busy. I can have Secretary Bay. Mr. Im specifically told me on the first day to bring any household questions directly to him," Alia said serenely. She had not been told this. She had simply decided it was probably good policy and had mentioned it to Wu Jin during dinner on the first night, framed as a general practice, and he had nodded. So technically it was true now. "I'll ask him tonight. Thanks for the heads up, Hajin." Hajin looked at her for a very long moment. His eyes had that quality that Tae-yoon's had, the assessing depth that was entirely their father's. Then he said, quietly and without the performance, "You're different." "From what?" she asked. "From the others," he said. "I know," she said. She looked at him steadily. "I'm not going anywhere, Ha-jin, just so you know." Something moved in his face. Not the softness, not yet. That would take longer. A crack. The beginning of a reassessment. By the end of the first week, the operations had slowed. By the end of the second, they had stopped entirely. This was not because the boys had given up. It was because something more interesting had happened, which was that they had started watching her instead. They watched her cook, which took up more of their attention than any of them would have admitted, because it turned out Aliyah cooked the way their mother had apparently cooked, which was a piece of information. Secretary Bae let slip accidentally over dinner one evening and then went very still about, in which Woo Jin, sitting at the head of the table, heard and did not react to visibly, though Aliyah noticed the particular quality of his stillness in that moment. They watched her handle their father, which was its own entertainment because she was the only person in the house who spoke to him as if his silence was not a verdict, as if his authority was a quality she respected but was not governed by, as if he was a person first and the most feared man in Seoul second. Woo Jin himself, they noticed, watched her back. He watched her with the focused, involuntary quality of a man who has lost the ability to look away from something and hasn't yet decided what to do about that. Junsu noticed first because Junsu was not quiet enough to be subtle about noticing things. He cornered Tae-yoon in their shared bathroom on a Thursday evening and said with zero preamble, "Appa looks at her." "I know," Tae-yoon said. "Like he looks at her." "I know. What do we do about that?" Tae-yoon was quiet for a moment, looking at his own reflection in the mirror with the expression of someone running a calculation. "Nothing yet," he said. "We watch." Ha-jin appeared in the doorway. He had apparently been listening. He looked at both of them with those quiet, ancient eyes and said, "She would be good for him." His brothers looked at him. "She doesn't move out of the way when he comes into a room," Ha-jin said. "Everyone else does. She just stands there. She talks to him like he's a person." He paused. "I think he needs that." The bathroom was quiet for a moment. "She makes really good rice," Junsu offered. "That's not the point," Tae-yoon said. "I know, but it's also not nothing." Aliyah was not thinking about Im Woo Jin. Or, rather, she was thinking about him in the way that a person tries very hard not to think about something and finds that the not thinking requires a disproportionate amount of mental energy. He was present in the house most evenings now in a way that Secretary Bae mentioned was somewhat unusual, that he tended to work late at the office and come home after midnight, and lately he had been home by 7. She told herself this had nothing to do with her. She told herself that firmly to herself in her room at night, while listing all the reasons it would be both professionally inappropriate and personally catastrophic to notice that Im Woo Jin was quietly, persistently, devastatingly paying attention to her. He did small things. He didn't make a production of them. He left a book on the kitchen counter that she'd mentioned in passing on the second day, a novel she'd said she hadn't been able to find in Seoul. He had said nothing about it, just left it there with a bookmark at page 30. He came into the kitchen one evening while she was chopping vegetables and stood near the counter, not in her way, just present, and they talked for 40 minutes about nothing of consequence, Seoul and Atlanta, and the specific emotional experience of living somewhere that was not home. He was, she discovered, a careful and genuinely interested listener. He remembered things, he noticed things. He noticed her in a way that was entirely different from the way powerful men had noticed her before, which had always had the quality of cataloging, of assessment, of deciding what category to put her in. Woo Jin noticed her the way someone notices a person they are very interested in understanding. This was, she told herself regularly, a problem. The problem accelerated in the third week when a man named Park Dae-hyun came to the house. Park Dae-hyun was an associate of Woo Jin's from the legitimate business side, a senior partner in the logistics firm, tall and smooth with the practiced charm of someone who had spent years being good at parties. He came for a dinner meeting on a Friday evening and was shown to the dining room by Secretary Bae while Aliyah finished the meal in the kitchen. When she brought the first course out, Park Dae-hyun looked up from the conversation he was having with Woo Jin and stopped mid-sentence. "This is your housekeeper," he said to Woo Jin, in Korean which Aliyah understood perfectly but didn't react to. "Miss Carter manages the household," Woo Jin said with a flatness in his voice she couldn't fully read. "She's lovely," Park Dae-hyun said in a way that was more observation than compliment, the kind that didn't ask permission. Aliyah set the plates down without acknowledging this, because she had spent years developing the skill of being in a room where people discussed her without speaking to her and not giving them the satisfaction of a reaction. She turned to go back to the kitchen. "Excuse me," Park Dae-hyun said, now addressing her directly and in English that was slightly too confident. "Where are you from?" "Your Korean is excellent." "Atlanta," she said. "Thank you. You speak Korean beautifully, very unusual." "I studied it," she said pleasantly.
How long have you worked for Woo Jin?
She glanced, briefly, at Wu Jin, who was watching this exchange with an expression that was entirely still in the specific way that preceded something that was not stillness at all. She filed that away. 3 weeks, she said. Excuse me, I have the next course to finish. She went back to the kitchen. In the kitchen, she stood at the stove and breathed for a moment and told herself that whatever was on Wu Jin's face was professional and contextual and not something she should be cataloging. In the dining room, Park Dae-hyun said, with the easy appreciation of a man who thought he was giving a compliment, "You have excellent taste, in all things." Wu Jin said nothing. The silence was the kind that carried. "She's interesting," Park Dae-hyun continued. "Has she been with you long? I might know someone who would—" "She works for me," Wu Jin said. It was 3 words at a volume barely above quiet, and it ended the sentence, the conversation, and apparently Park Dae-hyun's appetite for the topic entirely. The man picked up his wineglass and changed the subject. In the kitchen, Aliyah heard none of this. She finished the second course, brought it out, served it, and went back. She didn't see Wu Jin watch her walk away. She didn't see the way his jaw was set for the rest of the meal. She didn't see Park Dae-hyun notice the jaw and choose wisely not to mention the housekeeper again for the rest of the evening. Later that night, after Park Dae-hyun had gone and the house was quiet, Aliyah was in the kitchen cleaning up when Wu Jin appeared in the doorway. He still had his jacket on. He hadn't gone upstairs yet. "You don't have to do this tonight," he said. "Leave it for morning." "I'm almost done," she said. "It's fine." He stood in the doorway for a moment. She was aware of him in the specific way she was always aware of him in enclosed spaces. Like the air between them was a different temperature than the air elsewhere. She focused on the dishes. "Did Park Dae-hyun say something to you?" he asked. "Nothing offensive," she said, "but something." She turned and looked at him. He was watching her with an expression that was controlled and direct, and underneath the control, something that had heat in it, something she had no business noticing. "He was curious," she said. "It's fine, I handled it." "You shouldn't have to handle it," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "I'm okay," she said carefully, "but thank you." He nodded once. He turned to leave. At the door he stopped, his back to her, and said, without turning around, "You're good with them, the boys." "They're good kids," she said. Under the operations, she heard something that might have been a laugh, or the ghost of one, brief and involuntary. Then he went upstairs and she stood in the kitchen, holding a dish she had already dried twice and feeling something warm and entirely inconvenient in her chest. The shift happened, as shifts often do, through a small thing. On a Wednesday afternoon, 3 weeks in, Aliyah walked past Hajin's room and heard something that made her stop. It was quiet, the particular quality of quiet that is different from silence, the held quality of someone who is trying to contain something they cannot quite contain. She stood outside the door for a moment, then she knocked. He said, "Too even. Too controlled for a 17-year-old. She opened the door. Hajin was at his desk, pretending to look at his phone. The desk surface was carefully clear except for a single photograph, face down, that he'd turned over quickly when she came in. Not quickly enough. She didn't call attention to it. She set the glass of warm tea she'd been carrying on his desk, the honey ginger blend she'd noticed he took when he wasn't feeling well, and said, "I made extra." He looked at the tea. He looked at her. Something in his face was trying very hard to be the composed, controlled version of Hajin and was not quite succeeding. "What day is it?" she asked gently. He was quiet. "Then her birthday." Aliyah sat down uninvited in the chair by the window. She didn't say anything for a moment. She looked out at the city. "My dad died when I was 12, she said. "I used to feel it in my body the days that were his. The day his birthday was the day he left." She paused. "It doesn't get smaller, it just gets more familiar." Hajin was very still. "You don't have to be okay about it," she said. "Not today." He didn't cry. He was too much his father's son to cry in front of someone he'd known 3 weeks. But something in him settled, the way a held breath settles when you finally let it go. He picked up the tea, he drank it. They sat there for 40 minutes without talking much, Aliyah read. Hajin did whatever Hajin was doing with his phone. When she got up to start dinner, he said, without looking up, "She would have liked you." Aliyah paused at the door. "Tell me about her sometime," she said. "I'd like to know." She went downstairs. She didn't hear him pick up the photograph. But when she passed his room later that night, it was face up on the desk. Tae-yoon found out within 12 hours, because Hajin told him, which was the first thing Hajin had voluntarily shared about his mother with anyone outside the family in 4 years. Tae-yoon sat with this information for a full day before he went to find Aliyah in the kitchen on a Thursday evening and said, with the precise deliberate cadence of someone who has practiced a sentence, "I like the way you run the house." Aliyah looked up from the cookbook she was consulting. "Thank you, Tae-yoon." He stood in the kitchen doorway with his hands in his pockets and the expression of someone who has decided to say the rest of it and is going to do it quickly. "Hajin doesn't talk about our mom. He hasn't in a long time. Since you came, he stopped, recalibrated. He seems different." "Good different?" she asked. A pause. "Yeah," he said. "Good different." She looked at him for a moment. He had his father's eyes and his mother's mouth. She had learned from the photograph she'd been shown once, and in this moment he looked like exactly what he was, a 17-year-old boy who had been managing enormous things for a very long time and was very tired of managing them alone. "You all seem different," she said. "You're less interested in whether I can be moved." The corner of his mouth moved, slightly. "You can't be moved." "You couldn't have known that from the beginning," she said. "I figured it out pretty fast," he said. And there was something in his voice that was the first honest version of amusement she'd heard from him, direct and unguarded. She felt the warm thing in her chest again, and this time it was specifically about the boy in the doorway, not about anything else, and she let herself feel it because this was what she'd come here for. Not the salary, not the contract. This. Junseo was the last to fall, and he fell the hardest, which was entirely appropriate, given that he was Junseo. He had been watching the gradual shift in his brothers, with the focused intensity of someone who was part delighted and part suspicious that something was happening to the group dynamic that he hadn't engineered himself. He had also, over the course of 2 weeks, been having an increasingly difficult time maintaining his position as the household's primary noise source, because Aliyah had developed the habit of turning his music down, using a second Bluetooth connection he hadn't discovered yet, and replacing it with a carefully curated playlist that somehow always included at least 3 songs he actually liked, which made it impossible to be properly annoyed. The moment that dissolved him entirely happened on a Saturday afternoon when he got home from football practice with a twisted ankle and a bruised ego and the specific combination of physical pain and teenage pride that makes boys impossible. He came through the door trying not to limp and nearly walked into Aliyah, who took one look at him, said nothing, pointed at the couch, and 30 seconds later was sitting across from him with an ice pack and a bowl of the instant ramen from the cabinet, prepared exactly the way the handwritten label had described, which he had not thought anyone had ever read. "How did you?" he started. "I read the label," she said. He looked at her. He looked at the ramen. He looked at the ice pack on his ankle. He looked like he was trying to maintain a position and failing. "It's good ramen," he said finally in a small voice. "I know," she said. "Eat." He ate. She sat across from him with her book and didn't make a thing of any of it, didn't point out that he'd been trying to run her out of the house for 3 weeks, didn't extract any acknowledgement or apology or gratitude. Just sat with him the way you sit with someone when they're hurting and don't need to perform being fine. When he finished, he looked at her with the expression of a boy who has made a decision and has the kind of personality that commits entirely to decisions the moment they are made. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the speaker thing." "I know," she said. "And for the volume 8 notebook. It was thorough," she allowed. "And for the time I moved all your shoes to the garage." She looked up from her book. "That was you?" "Hajin planned it," he said quickly. "I just executed." "I'm going to need to have a separate conversation with Hajin," she said. Junseo almost smiled. The almost became actual, then became wide, and then became the helpless full-body grin of a boy who was 17 and had just, for perhaps the first time in years, laughed at something that wasn't a prank he'd designed himself. Aliyah watched him laugh and felt the warm thing in her chest bloom into something that had nothing clinical about it at all. She was in trouble. She had known it for a while. She was in serious, professional, entirely predictable trouble because somewhere between the first dinner and the Saturday afternoon ramen and all the evenings in between, she had stopped managing her feelings about Im Woo-jin and started simply having them, which was a different and considerably more dangerous thing. She had also noticed, because she was observant and could not stop herself from being observant, that he had stopped being a man who came home and was present in his house and had become a man who came home and was present specifically in whatever room she was in. That he knew how she took her tea, that he had, without comment, replaced the chair in her room that had a broken leg. That when she was tired, which she showed in a specific way she hadn't thought anyone had noticed, a slight tension across her shoulders and a quieter quality to her voice, he found reasons to be in whatever room she was in, not doing anything, just present, in the specific way that said, "I see you and I'm not going anywhere." She was in serious trouble. And somewhere across the city, in a meeting that she knew nothing about, in a room that contained people who had opinions about Im Woo-jin's household arrangements and his sudden tendency to be home at 7 instead of midnight, something was being discussed that would reach the house before the month was out. Woo-jin did not know this yet either. He was sitting in his study at 10:30 on a Thursday night, looking at a quarterly report he was absolutely not reading, listening to the sound of the house below him and the particular quality of a space that had, in the past month, become something different from what it had been before. Something that felt, in a way he had not let himself think about directly, like a home. He thought about the way she'd looked at him that morning at breakfast, when he'd said something that surprised her and she'd laughed, sudden and real, the kind of laugh that belongs entirely to the person laughing and asks nothing from anyone watching. He thought about the fact that he had been watching. He thought about the fact that he had been doing a great deal of watching and a very insufficient amount of not watching, and that this situation had reached a point that required acknowledgement. He put the report in the drawer. He went downstairs. She was in the kitchen. She always seemed to be in the kitchen at this hour, not cleaning, just present, sometimes reading, sometimes doing something with the small container of spices she kept on the shelf that she'd brought from home. He'd asked her about it once. She'd said her mother had made the blend herself, and she'd carried it from Atlanta because it made a kitchen smell like somewhere she belonged. He stood in the doorway, and she looked up from her book, and neither of them said anything for a moment. The kitchen smelled like her mother's spice blend and something else, something specific to the house now, something warm and lived in that it hadn't smelled like before she came. "You should sleep," she said. "So should you," he said. "I will in a minute." He walked to the counter, because standing in doorways had become insufficient and he had stopped pretending otherwise, and he stood near her and said without preparation or strategy, simply because it was true and he was tired of not saying true things, "I'm glad you came." She looked up at him. The kitchen light was low and warm, and she was looking at him with those eyes that had never once been small in the presence of him, that had looked at him from the beginning, as if his weight was interesting but not governing, and something in his chest did what it had been doing for weeks, the thing he had been managing, and was now simply done managing. "I'm glad too," she said. They stood there, too close, not close enough, in the warm kitchen that smelled like home, and the world outside the window was Seoul at midnight, enormous and indifferent, and in this kitchen it was just two people who had found each other in the particular way that people find each other when they weren't looking and cannot explain the finding and don't want to give it back. He reached over and moved a strand of hair from her face, his fingers barely touching her cheek, gentle and deliberate, and she went very still the way a person goes still when they are afraid that moving will end something. His phone rang. He didn't move for one beat, too. Then he stepped back and answered it, and his face went from what it had been to something else entirely, the other face, the one that handled the other side of his life. His voice dropped, went flat, went into the language of his work. Aaliyah breathed. She looked at her book. She couldn't read a word of it. He spoke for 2 minutes, said 4 sentences, and ended the call. He stood with his back to her for a moment, and she could see the shift in him, the way he reassembled the wall, and she felt the loss of the moment like a physical thing. When he turned back, his expression was composed and careful, and she could not fully read what was underneath it, except that it was there, whatever it was, and it was hers, even through the wall. "I have to make some calls," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her for one more moment, then he left. Aaliyah sat in the kitchen for a long time after. She told herself again firmly that this was a situation she needed to manage. She told herself he was her employer. She told herself there were 100 reasons this was complicated and 0 reasons it was simple. She told herself all of this and believed none of it. Upstairs, in his study, Im Woo-jin sat with his hand and the call he had made still hanging in the air of the room, and thought about what had just happened in the kitchen and what the person on the other end of his call had just told him, and understood that something was moving toward his house that had nothing to do with quarterly reports or household staff, and that the woman in his kitchen, the woman he had not been able to stop thinking about for 30 days, was standing in the path of it. His jaw tightened. He would deal with it. He dealt with everything. But something about the idea of dealing with this, of whatever was coming arriving anywhere near her, produced a feeling in his chest that was not the controlled cold calculation he applied to everything else. It was something much older, much more fundamental, the feeling of a man who has identified the most important thing in his vicinity and will not, under any circumstances, permit harm to come to it. He picked up his phone again and made 3 more calls. Outside the window, Seoul burned in the dark, and somewhere in the city, people who wanted something from Im Woo-jin were moving. They had no idea what they were moving toward. And the boys, asleep in their rooms on the 2nd floor, had no idea that what their father was fighting to protect was not just the house or the organization. It was the woman downstairs who had shown up in a gray hoodie carrying a jar of her mother's spices and had, without being asked and without making a ceremony of it, simply made this house feel like the home it had been trying to become for 11 years. Tae-yoon would find out first, in the morning, when he came downstairs and found his father still in the kitchen with a 2nd cup of coffee and a look on his face that Tae-yoon recognized from the photographs of a man who had loved someone completely and wasn't afraid of the cost. He would go back upstairs and knock on his brother's doors and tell them what he'd seen. And Ha-jin would say we should help him. And Jun-si would say obviously, and the 3 of them would begin a very different kind of operation, one that had nothing to do with driving anyone away and everything to do with making absolutely sure that the right person stayed. But that was the morning. Tonight, the city ran through its hours and the house held its warmth, and whatever was coming was still a day away. And in the kitchen, Aaliyah finally put down her book, turned off the light, and went to bed, carrying something in her chest that felt, despite everything she knew about being careful, like the beginning of something true. The morning after the kitchen, everything felt different, and nothing looked different, which was its own kind of difficult. Woo-jin was at the breakfast table when she came downstairs at 6:30. He looked up. She looked at him. They said good morning with the careful precision of two people who have decided to put something back in a box and are discovering that the box is too small now. She made coffee. He watched her make it. This was no longer a neutral activity. Tae-yoon came downstairs at 7 and stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at both of them with the forensic attention of a boy who had inherited his father's capacity for reading a room, then very quietly sat down and said nothing and ate his breakfast with the studied innocence of someone who was absolutely cataloging everything for later analysis. Junso and Ha-jin arrived 4 minutes apart and both had the same quality that Tae-yoon had, the deliberate neutrality of people performing not noticing. She had lived with them for a month. She knew exactly what not noticing looked like on all three of them. It looked like this. After Woo-jin left for the office, Junsu leaned across the table toward Tae-yoon and said, at a volume he apparently thought was a whisper, he stayed for breakfast. He always stays for breakfast now, Ha-jin said. He didn't before she came. I know, Tae-yoon said. Aaliyah at the sink said without turning around, I can still hear you. All three of them went silent with the synchronized guilt of boys who had been caught. She turned around. She looked at them. They looked back at her with expressions that were, for perhaps the first time in her month in this house, completely unguarded. All three of them. No performance, no strategy. Just three teenagers watching her with the hopeful, slightly desperate quality of people who want something very much and are trying to figure out if they're allowed to want it. Finish your breakfast, she said gently. You'll be late. They finished their breakfast. They left. But at the door, Ha-jin paused and looked back at her and said, in a voice that was quiet enough to be only for her, he smiles more now. Since you came. She stood in the foyer after they'd gone and held that sentence for a long time. The trouble arrived on a Wednesday 6 weeks after she'd come to the house. It arrived in the form of a man who appeared at the gate at 11 in the morning when Secretary Bae was out running errands and the security detail that Woo-jin maintained at the house perimeter was between rotation shifts. The man gave his name to the gate intercom as a business associate, a name she didn't recognize, which in itself meant nothing because she had no reason to know the full architecture of Woo-jin's professional world. She buzzed him through to the front door, opened it, and understood immediately that something was wrong. There were two of them. The man who had given his name was 40, broad, with the specific quality of stillness that wasn't peace, it was coiled readiness. The one behind him was younger and said nothing. They were in suits that were good enough to be legitimate and not good enough to be convincing. She noticed this in the 3 seconds she had before the first man spoke. Miss Carter, he said in Korean. Her name in his mouth landed with the particular weight of a word that has been researched. We'd like to speak with you. About what? She said. She kept her voice level. About your employer, he said, and what you may have seen in this house. She looked at him. She looked at the man behind him. She thought about the notebook she'd found in the kitchen cabinet that said Operation Maid Eviction, about the careful geometry of the security rotation she'd noticed without meaning to, about Woo-jin's phone calls at midnight and the specific quality of his attention whenever certain names came up in conversation. She had spent a month in this house. She had not been not paying attention. I think you should leave, she said. The man's expression didn't change. He stepped forward, slightly, enough to be in the doorway threshold. We're not asking much, he said. A conversation. Information that you've surely noticed living here, Mr. Im's movements, his meetings, his guests. We're willing to compensate you generously. I'd like you to leave now, she said. Monsieur Carter. His voice had shifted a degree colder. You're in a complicated position. A foreign national, a work visa. These things can become complicated very quickly when the wrong attention is paid. She looked at him for a long moment. Her heart was doing something emphatic in her chest, and she was choosing, very deliberately, not to let that show. You have 30 seconds, she said, to be off this property before I call the police. Something moved in his expression. Recalculation. She had not given him the response he'd planned for, and he was deciding what to do next. What he did not do was leave. What happened instead was that the front gate behind them made a sound, a specific electronic sound, and the security team that had been between rotations materialized out of what appeared to be nowhere, 4 men, in the specific unhurried way of professionals who have already assessed and already know how this ends. And behind them on the driveway, a car that had not been there 60 seconds ago, Woo-jin got out of it. He had clearly been in the office when the call came, she realized later, because he was still in the full weight of his formal work presence, charcoal suit, the specific bearing that he carried in professional contexts that made the space around him feel like it had been reorganized in his favor. He walked up the driveway and the two henne at her door went from the specific posture of people applying pressure to the specific posture of people who have just realized they have miscalculated the situation entirely. He didn't run. He didn't raise his voice. He walked at the pace of a man who already knows the outcome and is not in a hurry because time is not a factor when you have already decided what happens. He came to the door and stood beside her, and the men in the doorway had that specific look of people reassessing an escape route. He looked at her first, before he looked at them. Just for 1 second, a sweep of her face, a check she understood was for damage, and then he looked at the men with an expression that had no warmth anywhere in it. "You have 3 seconds, he said to the men quietly, to explain why you're at my door." Neither of them spoke. The security team was already moving. Aaliyah stepped back from the door. She was shaking slightly. Not from fear, exactly. She had held herself together through the conversation, held the ground, not given them anything. The shaking was the body releasing what it had been holding, and it happened after, which was the appropriate time for it. She went to the kitchen and stood at the counter and breathed. She heard Wu Jin speaking in the foyer, low and specific, and then the sound of the front door closing, and then footsteps, his footsteps. She knew the weight of them coming to the kitchen. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. She was looking at the counter. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," she said. "I'm fine." She paused. "I kept them at the door." "I didn't let them in, I know," he said. His voice was different from what it was in the foyer. It had something in it she couldn't name, something that had been cracked open. "I got the gate alert the moment they came through. I watched the feed on the way here. 30 minutes from downtown," she said. 24, he said. She looked up at him. He was standing in the kitchen doorway, and his expression was the one he had been carrying all month underneath the controlled surface, the one that had been building since the first night, since the book on the counter, since the conversation about Atlanta and Seoul and the spice blend on the shelf. He was looking at her with everything he had not been saying, all of it at once, with the raw, unmanaged quality of a man who has just watched someone he cares about be threatened and cannot any longer maintain the professional distance he's been using as a structural element. "Wu Jin," she said, because she needed to say something. He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and held her. "Not the way you hold someone when you're comforting them. The way you hold someone when they are the specific person you drove 24 minutes in a car for, the person whose face you looked at before you looked at the threat, the person whose safety is the organizing principle of the decision you made the moment you saw the gate alert." His arms came around her and she felt the whole of him, solid and present and shaking slightly, she realized, which meant that under the controlled walk up the driveway, under the quiet 3 words to the men at the door, under all of it he had been afraid. For her, she held him back. She pressed her face into his shoulder and felt the enormous, unfamiliar relief of being held by someone who had come. They stood like that for a long time. When they finally separated, she looked up at him, and he was looking at her with the specific, unflinching attention of a man who has decided he is done, pretending that this is professional. "I need to explain some things to you," he said. "I know some things already," she said. "I've been paying attention for 6 weeks." Something moved in his face. He almost smiled. It was the version of almost smiling that she had learned meant he was genuinely caught off guard, not performed, not managed. "What do you know?" he asked. "Enough," she said. "The rest you can tell me." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, and they sat down at the kitchen table, and he talked, and she listened, and the afternoon moved around them, and outside the window Seoul went about its enormous business, entirely unaware that in a kitchen in the hills above the city, 2 people were figuring out the shape of something true. The boys came home at 4 and found them still at the table, not talking anymore, just present the comfortable way that had been building for weeks and had finally arrived at its natural form. Junsu stopped dead in the kitchen doorway. Taeyun walked into him from behind. Ha-jin appeared around the side of both of them and looked at the kitchen table, and then at Taeyun with an expression that said, "I told you." Wu Jin looked at his sons looked at him. There was a very specific parental conversation happening entirely in expressions, the kind that teenagers conduct with their parents in the presence of a third party who they are pretending not to be discussing. "Something happened today," Wu Jin said. "We heard," Taeyun said, and then went slightly still, because he hadn't meant to admit that he'd already gotten the information from one of the security detail guys who was also his football coach and had a loose working definition of what was appropriate to tell 17-year-olds. "From who?" Wu Jin said. "Secretary Bei," Taeyun said, which was faster thinking than the situation warranted. Secretary Bei in the hallway behind them made a small, resentful noise. "It's fine," Aaliyah said. "Everyone's fine." The boys looked at her. The look they gave her now was different from the look they'd given her on the first day. There was no assessment in it, no calculation about what category she occupied. It was the look of 3 boys who had decided separately and together that this was someone they could not afford to lose. "Are you staying?" Ha-jin asked. He said it quietly, directly, in the way he had of stripping things to their actual meaning. Ha-jin. Wu Jin said. "It's okay," Aaliyah said. She looked at Ha-jin. She looked at all 3 of them, Taeyun with his father's eyes, Jun-seo with his mother's expressiveness, Ha-jin with the weight he had been carrying since he was 6 years old, and she had sat in his room on his mother's birthday and told him he didn't have to be okay. "Yes," she said, "I'm staying." The relief on their faces was 3 different versions of the same thing. Jun-seo said something that was technically under his breath but was clearly intended to be heard, which was "finally." And Wu Jin gave him a look, and Jun-seo looked at the ceiling with the studied innocence of a boy who had said nothing. The threat was not over. Aliyah understood this from the conversation she'd had with Wu Jin at the kitchen table. The men who had come to the door were connected to a rival faction that had been testing the edges of Wu Jin's territory for 3 months, looking for leverage, for information, for a point of vulnerability. They had apparently decided that the new household staff, a foreign woman without deep ties in Seoul, might be a manageable point of access. They were wrong about this, as the afternoon had demonstrated, but wrong people with resources did not simply stop being wrong people with resources. The situation required management. Wu Jin's version of management was thorough and swift. By that evening, the security rotation at the house had been doubled and restructured. Specific protocols were in place for any unfamiliar approach to the property. Secretary Bey was given updated instructions about gate access that he received with the visible relief of someone whose professional life had been mostly composed of managing the consequences of insufficient security and who welcomed any improvement. Wu Jin made calls. He made many calls. The particular quality of his voice on those calls was the voice she had heard once or twice before, the one that lived underneath the dinner table conversation and the morning coffee, and the careful, patient presence he offered his sons, the voice of the man who ran the organization, flat and final, and completely without doubt about the outcome. She watched him from across the room while he made those calls, not listening to the content, just watching the bearing, and thought about what it meant to love something complicated. Because she was past pretending she didn't love him, she had been past pretending that for a while. What she hadn't resolved was what to do with it, what it cost, what it was worth, and whether the man on the phone who made other people afraid was compatible with the man who had rushed home in 24 minutes and held her in the kitchen without asking anything except, "Are you hurt?" She thought those were probably the same man. She thought that was the answer to the question. The boys were quieter that evening. Not subdued, Jun Seo was constitutionally incapable of subdued, but gentler, more present, moving through the house with the quality of people who have been reminded of something important and are still sitting with the reminder. Hajin helped her make dinner without being asked, standing at the counter beside her and doing what she told him to do with the focused seriousness he brought to everything, and at some point she looked at him and thought about the photograph on his desk, and the birthday, and the woman who had died, and the space that had been empty in this house for 11 years, and something in her settled into a shape that she hadn't known she was looking for. She was not his mother, she knew that. She would never be that, and she wouldn't try to be, and she thought Hajin of all of them understood this most precisely, that what she offered was not a replacement but something new, something that existed in its own right and didn't require the old shape to accommodate it. "You cut the onion wrong," Hajin said. "I cut it exactly right," she said. "Our family cuts it this way," he said, and demonstrated with the gravity of someone establishing lineage. "Show me again," she said. He showed her again. She watched. She did it his way. He nodded with the solemn approval of a 17-year-old who has just transmitted family knowledge and feels good about it. She laughed, and he almost laughed, and across the kitchen Tae-yoon, coming in to set the table, watched this exchange with the expression of a boy who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been handed a very small and very real piece of relief. 3 days after the incident at the door, Wu Jin came to find her in the evening. She was in the living room reading, a space she had claimed as hers in the informal way that spaces in a house get claimed, and he sat down across from her in the chair that had become his chair, close enough to talk, and said her name once, and she looked up. "The men who came," he said. "The situation is resolved." She waited. "They won't come back," he said. His voice was quiet and entirely final. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about asking him what resolved meant in this context, and then decided there were some things she understood without needing them translated, and this was one of them. "Okay," she said. "I should have told you before," he said, "about what the work is, what the risk might be." "You told me," she said, "at the kitchen table. I should have told you before that day," he said. He was looking at her with the stripped-down honesty she had come to recognize as the real version of him, the version under the weight of everything he carried. "You had a right to know what you were walking into. I walked in with my eyes open," she said. "I had a pretty good idea from week 1. Your sons had a notebook called Operation Maid Eviction. I found a whole system of things in this house that told me what kind of organization ran it." She paused. "I made a choice. I stayed." He looked at her for a long time. "Why?" he asked. She put down her book. She looked at him across the room that had become the room they both sat in the evenings, in the house that had slowly become something that neither of them had planned for it to become. "Because the boys needed someone who wouldn't leave," she said, and then because, she stopped. "Because," he repeated quietly. She looked at him. "Because you have 24 minutes from downtown," she said, "and you used all of them." The silence in the room had a quality she recognized, the same quality as the kitchen, the same weight and warmth, except this time there was no phone call, no interruption, no reason to stop. He stood up and crossed the room and sat beside her on the sofa, close but not touching, and looked at her with the expression that had been building for 6 weeks. "Aliyah," he said. "Just her name." Her whole name, with every syllable given its weight, the way he had said it from the beginning, the way that had always sounded like he was saying something larger. "I know," she said. "I want to be certain you know," he said. "I'm not someone who does things carelessly. I'm not someone who—" He stopped. "Tried again. In 11 years I have not brought anyone into this house and meant it." He was looking at her with everything. All of it, unmanaged, not contained, just present. "You changed the house. You changed my sons. You changed." He stopped. "Tell me," she said softly. "You changed me," he said. "You walked into my kitchen and made food from scratch and told my son he didn't have to be okay and argued with Junsiu about Bluetooth and sat in my kitchen at midnight because you couldn't sleep. And you changed something that I had decided was finished." He looked at her hands, at her face. "I don't know how to do this slowly," he said. "I'm not built for slowly. I've been watching you for 6 weeks and that's slow," she said. Something cracked in his expression, the ghost of the laugh she had been trying to see clearly since the first week. Then he reached over and took her hand, and she let him, and the room was the warm living room with the city outside the windows and the house quiet around them, and somewhere upstairs, 3 boys who were pretending to be asleep, but were absolutely not asleep. "Can I court you properly?" he said, and the word court was so formal and so entirely him, that she laughed, real and sudden, and he looked at her with that cracked open expression and said, "That's not a no. That's not a no," she agreed. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, slow and deliberate, and looked at her over it with an expression that said everything his restrained mouth had been choosing not to say, and she felt it in every part of herself, and the city went on outside, and the house held them in its warmth. From the top of the stairs in the dark, Hajin turned to his brothers and said nothing. He didn't need to. They had all heard the laugh. They all knew what it meant. Junsiu pumped his fist silently in the air. Taeyun put his hand over his face. Then he smiled in the dark where no one could see it except his brothers, and that was fine. Wu Jin courted her properly, which turned out to mean with the same precision and attention he brought to everything, which was formidable. He asked her things. Not the broad, easy questions of a man making conversation, but the specific questions of a man who wants to understand a person completely. About Atlanta and her parents and the 2 brothers she had raised alongside herself, about the work in Lagos and why she had studied Korean and what she was doing in Seoul before the job. He listened to the answers the way he listened to everything, with the full weight of his attention, which had the specific quality of making a person feel that what they were saying mattered in an absolute and uncavable way. She had never been listened to quite like that before. She found it alternately wonderful and terrifying. He took her to dinner on a Thursday, just the 2 of them, while the boys had a school event, and the restaurant was quiet and private, and the food was extraordinary, and across the table he was the version of him that the house had built over 6 weeks, present and warm and occasionally startling in his directness. She told him about Marcus, the ex in Atlanta, who had been beautiful and unreliable and had taught her very thoroughly that wanting someone could be separated from trusting them. He listened. He said simply, "I understand why you were careful, not that it wouldn't happen with him. Just that he understood the lesson." She found this more reassuring than any promise would have been. The boys were conducting their own operation in support of the romance, which they believed was subtle and was not. Junsiu had taken to mentioning, at breakfast, various activities that he thought 2 people might enjoy, framing them with the casual offhandedness of someone who had definitely not looked them up specifically. Ha-jin had started leaving Wu Jin's schedule on the kitchen counter, in a way that highlighted the evenings he was free. Taeyun had, without comment, reorganized the living room furniture so that the 2 chairs by the window were closer together. "I see what you're doing," Aliyah told them one morning. "We're not doing anything," Junsiu said, with the face of a person doing something. "It's transparent," she said. "Our father moves too slowly," Taeyun said, abandoning the performance. "Someone has to maintain momentum. He's doing fine," she said. "He made you dinner twice this week," Ha-jin said. "At home." He stood at the stove. "He has not done that since." He stopped. "Since a long time," Taeyun finished. She looked at them, 3 boys who wanted their father to be happy. 3 boys who had decided, in the specific way that teenagers decide things when they have committed to a position, that she was the mechanism by which that happened and had assigned themselves to the project accordingly. She thought about the notebook in the back of the cabinet. She thought about how far they had come from that. "I know," she said. "I see him." Ha-jin looked at her, and the expression on his face was the one that lived under all the others. The one that had been there in his room on his mother's birthday, quiet and old and hopeful, in the way that is more serious than the loud version. "Good," he said. The second threat came on a Saturday. She had taken the boys shopping, which was an activity that involved Junsiu in perpetual motion, Taeyun conducting the whole thing like a tactical exercise, and Ha-jin occasionally making observations about pricing that suggested he had been reading economics in his spare time. They were in the 3rd shop when she became aware of being watched. Not the ordinary ambient awareness of being in public, but the specific prickling recognition of focused attention that her body had learned to notice in the month since the men at the door. She didn't change her pace. She didn't look around. She gathered the boys with the understated efficiency of someone who has been paying attention to things they hope they never need, said they were going to try the shop across the street, and steered them toward the exit. She texted Wu Jin from the door with 3 words that Secretary Bei had given her in week 1 as the household emergency shorthand. Then she got the boys into the car, told the driver the house, and kept her voice even and her face composed the whole way back. Wu Jin was at the house when they arrived. He came out the front door as the car pulled up, and his eyes went to her first, the same sweep as the first time, and she was already nodding before he asked the question, meaning I'm fine, the boys are fine, it's okay. He exhaled, the short, controlled exhale of a man who has been managing his breathing since the text. He looked at his sons. They were looking back at him with the specific expressions of teenagers who have just been through something they don't have the full picture of and are choosing, for once, not to demand it immediately. Inside, he said to them. They went inside. He looked at her. Tell me everything, he said. Everything you noticed, she told him. He listened with the flat, focused attention of his operational self, asked 2 questions, and then made a call that lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, he said, it's handled, and she believed him because she had learned what that meant from him, the specific weight of it, the way he used the word, handled the way other people use the word done, finally, and with full commitment. I'm putting additional security on you and the boys when you leave the property, he said. Okay, she said. He looked at her. Something in his expression was different. She had learned to read his variations by now. This one was the version that preceded honesty. I need to ask you something, he said. Ask, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Not hesitating, organizing. Being with me, he said carefully, carries a specific weight. I've told you what I am. I've shown you some of what that means in practical terms. The risk isn't theoretical. The men at the door today at the shop, these aren't the last time. He held her eyes. I need to know that you understand that, and I need to know that you're choosing to be here with full knowledge of it. Not because I asked, not because of the boys. Because you want to be. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Atlanta and Lagos and Seoul and all the versions of herself that had found their way to a kitchen in the hills above a city she hadn't planned to love. She thought about 3 boys who had shown her, through the process of trying to drive her away, exactly what they needed and had never had. She thought about a man who had rushed here in 24 minutes and held her first before he handled anything else. I understand, she said. And I'm choosing. He stepped forward and held her face in his hands, his thumbs at her cheekbones, and looked at her with everything. Aaliyah, he said, her name the way he always said it, slow and full, like it meant the whole sentence. If anything happened to you, but it won't, she said. Because you're going to handle it. The ghost of the laugh, the real one. He pressed his forehead to hers, and she closed her eyes and felt the weight of him, present and warm and specifically hers. From the window above, 3 faces appeared briefly and then disappeared extremely quickly at the sound of Tai Yun's sharp, whispered instruction to get away from the window immediately. The faces disappeared. The window was empty. The house was quiet. The month that followed was the month that built the thing into its permanent shape. Wu Jin's rivals were neutralized methodically, with the specific thoroughness that made his name what it was. The security around the house and around Aaliyah specifically was restructured in a way that Secretary Bei described, in a private moment to a long-suffering colleague, as comprehensive to the point of being its own small military operation. 2 of Wu Jin's rivals reached out through intermediaries to discuss terms. Wu Jin discussed them on his terms, which were the only terms available. Aaliyah watched him manage the professional world from a careful distance that was not indifference. She understood now that the work and the man were not separable, that the discipline and the protection and the stillness and the 24 minutes from downtown all came from the same place, and that the place was not something she needed to fix or save him from, but something she needed to see clearly and stand beside. She stood beside it. She found to her own surprise that she was not afraid. The boys had one more operation. They conducted it on a Sunday afternoon in November with the collective focus of people who have identified a priority objective and are deploying their full combined skill set in service of it. Tae-yoon had the planning, Jun Seo had the execution energy, Ha-jin had apparently done research. They set the dining room table with the formal settings that were never used, arranged flowers from the garden, put on a playlist that Ha-jin had constructed with what he described to his brothers as strategic emotional intent, and informed their father at 3 in the afternoon that dinner would be served at 7, and that Ms. Carter had been told to expect a formal meal and should dress accordingly, none of which they had told Al-Alia at all. Wu Jin looked at the table. He looked at his sons. He said, "What are you doing?" "Setting the conditions," Tae-yoon said. "For what?" "For whatever you've been not doing," Junsu said. "For the past 2 months, I've been Appa," Ha-jin said. "Just that." The one word quiet and final and carrying the weight of 11 years and 17 years and all the space in between. Wu Jin looked at his youngest son, who had his mother's eyes and was looking at him with a certainty that was older than 17 and had no patience left for cautious management. She's staying, Hajin said. She told us she's staying, but she needs to know that you're asking. The dining room was very still. Wu Jin looked at the table. He looked at his sons. He said, "You three are impossible, we know," Junsiu said. "We learned from you." Wu Jin sat down at the table and his sons sat around him. And for a moment they were just the four of them in a room, the way they had been for 11 years, except that the shape of the room was different now, had been different for 2 months, because there was a space at the table that had been empty for a very long time and was waiting. He looked at Taeyun. "You planned this?" "Yes," Taeyun said. "It's good planning," Wu Jin said. Taeyun looked at the table, then looked at his father. "Don't waste it," Wu Jin asked Alia that evening. Not at the formal table, though the boys had said it beautifully and the flowers were exactly right, and the playlist was, she would tell Hajin later, extremely well researched. He asked her in the kitchen, after dinner, while they were cleaning up, standing side by side at the sink, the way they had stood 100 times in 2 months. He asked her without preparation or ceremony, which was entirely him, with just her name first and then the rest of it, that he wanted her to stay not as the household manager but as the woman in his house and in his life, and that he understood what he was asking and what it cost, and that he had not been afraid of many things in his life, but he was afraid of her saying no. She turned from the sink and looked at him and said yes before he finished the sentence. In the dining room, 3 boys who had been listening through the door that was very slightly open made a collection of sounds that involved Junsiu needing to physically clap a hand over his own mouth and Taeyun closing his eyes and Hajin simply standing very still with an expression on his face that was, for the first time in as long as anyone had seen, complete. Not managed, not the careful distance he kept between himself and things he was afraid to want, just complete. She moved her things from the second floor room to the room on the 3rd floor that looked over the garden. The boys helped. Junsu carried every box twice because the first time was not efficient enough and he had opinions about the arrangement of her books that he expressed at length. Taeyun organized the closet without being asked, in a way that suggested he had been thinking about the spatial problem for some time. Hajin placed the spice container from her shelf in the new kitchen space himself, carefully in the spot by the window where the afternoon light hit it, and stepped back and looked at it and said nothing, but the looking said everything. The following spring, in a ceremony at the house, because Aliyah had said she wanted to be married somewhere that smelled like home, and the house smelled like home now, Im Woo Jin married Aliyah Carter in front of their family and a small group of people who understood what they were witnessing. Secretary Bae cried, which he would deny if asked. Junsu gave a speech that was funny and genuine and required no preparation because Junsu had been rehearsing it in his head for 4 months. Taeyun stood at his father's side and had the expression of a man, because he was becoming a man, who has done something difficult and done it well. Hajin walked Aliyah down the garden path because she had asked him to, because she understood that he needed to be part of the giving, not just the receiving, and when he placed her hand in his father's and stepped back, his face was the face of a 17-year-old boy who has given something precious to someone he trusts and found that the giving felt like love. 6 months after the wedding, on an October morning, Aliyah stood in the kitchen with a cup of tea and a feeling in her body she did not yet have words for, and a look on her face. Secretary Bae, coming through for his morning briefing, noticed immediately and retreated from immediately, because 30 years of working for this family had taught him when to be elsewhere. She had just worked out the words when Woo Jin came downstairs. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her, the way he still looked at her, with everything, nothing managed, nothing held back, and said, "What is it?" She set down her tea. She looked at him. She said the thing she had worked out. His face did what it did when something caught him completely off guard, the specific crack in the composed surface, except this time it was bigger, and the laugh that had been almost for 2 months, broke all the way open, real and full, and from somewhere underneath everything, and he crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and held her face in his hands and kissed her the way he had been kissing her since the October evening 6 months ago, when she had said yes, with everything, no management, just him. From the top of the stairs, 3 voices, because the boys had very sensitive hearing and were always aware of the emotional temperature of the kitchen, said in staggered succession, Junso first, then Taeyun, then Hajin last and quietest, and with the specific weight he always carried when things mattered. "Is that? I think that's. She's going to be a mother." The house held them in its warmth. The city went on outside. The garden below the window was bright in the October morning, and the spice jar on the kitchen shelf caught the light and filled the room with the smell of Atlanta and home, and everything that the house had been trying to become for 11 years, and had finally, completely become. But here is what the boys did not know yet. Here is what even Aliyah had not yet told Woo Jin, the detail she had discovered that morning alongside the first detail, the second line on the test, the confirmation she was still processing when he came downstairs. It wasn't 1, it was 2, and Woo Jin, who had 3 sons who knew exactly what 2 lines meant given his personal history, had not looked at the test yet. He was still holding her face. He was still laughing in the real way that had taken 2 months to get from him. He did not know yet that in 6 months this house, which had taken a curvy woman from Atlanta and a jar of her mother's spices and a notebook called Operation Maid Eviction to become a home, was going to become something louder and fuller and more completely itself than it had ever been. He didn't know yet. But the spice jar caught the light, and the boys were already making noise at the top of the stairs, and somewhere in the city the organization ran on its precise and managed course, and here in this kitchen, at the center of all of it, Aaliyah Carter, who was now Aaliyah M, laughed into her husband's shoulder and decided to let him find out in his own time. Some things she had learned were worth the wait. Subscribe to Afro-Korean Drama Empire, besties, and hit that notification bell, because what happens when Im Woo-jin finds out there are two, and what the boys do when they meet their siblings, and what the organization's enemies try next when they discover that the woman who wouldn't leave has made him more powerful and more dangerous than he has ever been. All of that is coming. And you do not want to miss what these triplets do when they find out they are about to be outnumbered. Hit that subscribe button. We'll see you in the next one.